As I read recently, it feels a bit like being a lion in a den of Daniels at this moment. My background is that I spent 10 years teaching religious education in both maintained and independent schools in the Midlands and in London. I then trained as a Baptist minister and was a Baptist pastor here in Oxford and in the city for 11 years. And I'm now the staff of Regent's Park College, which, as Julian alluded to earlier, is just around the corner from here, and glad to be working in partnership with Father Richard and with the Christian Muslim Forum, which I've been a member since its inception. And I'm here as a late substitute, it should be said, to present the case against faith schools. We had somebody drop out, and Julian asked me if I would do this, so I guess I can't stay the whole day. But I'm going to say my piece and then disappear before we got too many missiles at me. I want to make some preliminary comments, which first of all remind us that we stand within a historical heritage in which the role of faith communities in the development of education in this country and elsewhere has been very significant, and that needs to be acknowledged. And part of the reason we are where we are today in relation to the faith schools that we have in Great Britain is because of the heritage that we have. However, it's not an ambivalent heritage. And ironically, the reason that Richard and I and Blackfriars and Regents are here in the way that we are here is because until 1870, you could not graduate from the University of Oxford unless you signed the 39 Articles of Religion of the Anglican Church. And if you like, the Anglican hegemony had the monopoly of education in the ancient universities. And that's why dissenters, nonconformists, Catholics, people of other religious traditions began to form their own academies in order to educate their own young people. So we now find ourselves able to be back in Oxford and having a rather interesting position this morning of arguing against the position of faith-based academies when I'm a member and teaching staff in a faith-based academy. But I want to tease that out a little bit more in a minute. I think we also need, for reasons of history and our culture, to recognise that there are particular needs of religious communities, especially minority and migrant communities. And we're faced with particular issues in Britain because of our colonial heritage, and that too is part of the factor that we need to take into account today. Thirdly, in arguing or making a case or expressing some reservations about faith schools, that is not to say that there is not a proper place for the exploration of the historical, cultural and spiritual importance of religion within education in the maintained sector, to pick up Richard's language of earlier. I myself have always been committed to that, and regardless of whatever faith profession one may or may not make, it seems to me you cannot be an educated person if you do not understand the role that faith and religion have played in our society and in global history. So that in making a case against faith schools, that's not to make a case against the teaching of religion in school, not just simply as a historical or cultural feature, but recognising its importance in the formation of the nation and the world as we know it, and its spiritual significance for many people in the world today. And then finally, by the way, of sort of preliminary clarifying remarks, I'm speaking out of a non-conformist tradition as a Baptist minister, which arose again out of the experience of prejudice and even persecution by religious or secular dominant traditions. And we need to recognise that too. So we stand here in this particular hall, which has its own experience of history. We stand within a couple of hundred yards of the place where martyrs were burnt for the sake of their religious beliefs. And so you can see why there would be people in our own society who would say, whatever we do, we don't want to construct social structures which lead to those sorts of religious differences and that sort of religious conflict in our society. So we need to bear that in mind. So those preliminary comments. Secondly, I want to just underline what's already emerged in what's been presented so far. We're talking about a number of different things when we talk about faith schools. So obviously there are those which are, if you like, privately funded and community-run schools, the madrasas, which Morris has alluded to, and of course many of us have grown up and appreciated the historic Sunday school movement in this country, which has given so much to education, and which still persists, although in a fairly vestigial form. The last figures I saw were for the year 2000 in which 4% of the children in this country had some connection with the Christian church, compared with, say, 50% in 1900. So that association of religious communities providing faith-based education, evenings, weekends, Sundays, whenever it may be, has been significant in our country, but has declined hugely. Seems to me that there can be no objection to that sort of school which doesn't attract state funding. It's simply what the faith communities are doing to provide an appropriate education for their young people. So in a sense, I want to put that on one side. Secondly, we noticed voluntary controlled schools, which are those schools run by faith communities but which are open to all. There may be, as it were, some sort of religious ethos to it, but usually a fairly open ethos. And that would be typical of the majority of Anglican schools in our country today, that they are local community schools to all intents and purposes, and depending on the particular staff, the activity of the vicar and so on, they may or may not have a stronger or weaker religious component. But they are open to all, and they don't provide religious tests on admission. And that would be true of an institution like Regent's Park College. We admit at any one time about 100 or so undergraduates to read the degrees of the university, and there are no religious tests on those students whatsoever. And we feel it would be inappropriate to be in receipt of public funds and make religious barriers in their way. And then there is the category of voluntary aided schools, publicly funded faith schools, and now that's being increased by the categories that we've noted, the emergence of academies, of free schools, and those sort of issues. And I suppose it's that which I want to address particularly. Public funds going into faith schools which have admissions tests based on faith categories and whose curriculum is dominated by the religious tradition of a particular community. What objections may there be? Well, Richard has kindly begun the case for me in his antithesis movements. There would be those, of course, in our society, particularly militant and vocal today, who would make the case on the basis of their atheistic convictions. If Professor Dawkins were here from just down the road, he would no doubt be saying that the state has no business promoting outdated and mutually contradictory beliefs. What on earth do you think we are doing? We live in a scientific age, we live in a secular age, the state has no business. So there would be those, I'm not among them, but we have to note that argument and recognise that's part of the background to our conversation today, who from the basis of a fairly militant atheism would want to question the validity and viability of faith schools. Secondly, we could identify, if you like, a secular argument that the state has no business in supporting any particular religious or sectarian group. And it would be interesting, wouldn't it, if we were to say, well, what other criteria might we have for creating special school provision? And one of the questions people might ask is, why should religion be privileged as a category when it comes to education that is publicly funded? In other words, if a political party came to the state and said, we belong to this particular political group, this is our political philosophy, we would like you to fund us in providing education for our young people, we'd like them brought up in this particular ideology, I suspect many people would have quite strong reservations. If people did so on the basis of their ethnic identity and said we want to create black schools or Asian schools, I suspect many of us would have strong reservations. So there's a fundamental philosophical question we might need to address as to why religion should be privileged as an identifier in providing separation in the way of education. If religion, why not politics, why not ethnicity, why not any other category people may come up with? Thirdly, there is the argument from finance. This goes deep into my particular heritage. I suspect now that all those with a Christian background tend to, as we put it, lean on the establishment. Since the 1944 Education Act, which Richard referred to earlier, and particularly with the decline in church attendance over the last half century or more, I suspect you'll find many Christians of all traditions hoping to get their children into their local Church of England school. 100 years ago, just over, this would have been unthinkable. And in 1902, when the new Prime Minister Balfour tried to introduce a new Education Act, which brought in religious schools into the state system, there isn't time to go into the detail now, there was a long, vocal and high-profile campaign against what was then presented as Rome on the rates. And it was led by nonconformists, and the National Passive Resistance Movement was founded by Dr. John Clifford, the Baptist minister of Westbourne Park Baptist Church. And Clifford and others complained and objected conscientiously and strongly about religious teaching being funded and being smuggled in, as they saw it, into the state system. They refused to pay that part of their rates which was allocated to education. Many of them were brought before their magistrates. Clifford, amongst others, had his goods distrained in order to pay for the fine and the legal costs and the money that they should have had. 170 people were in prison. Now, as we've seen, things have changed. The 1944 Education Act began to resolve some of these issues, but there is a question mark about how taxpayers' money is to be used and whether there is any justification for that sort of funding to be used for the benefit of a particular religious group in a diverse and plural society. Fourthly, there is what we might call the social cohesion argument, and Richard has already alluded to this. It's argued that faith schools create cultural and religious ghettos which reify religious distinctions and foster suspicion and sow seeds for potential conflict. We've already heard the example of the case in Northern Ireland, and many people would be anxious that the strengthening of the faith school movement here would lead to increasing separation between young people. A couple of years ago, one of our Christian Muslim meetings in Birmingham, we were hearing from faith leaders in that community, and we explored together the idea of parallel lives, in which people, as it were, live in cultural and religious ghettos. They may live alongside each other, they may be neighbours to all intents and purposes, but they have no interaction. If that is already happening in our society, would not the further development of faith schools simply exacerbate and make this even further problem? So a social cohesion argument. But finally, as a person of faith and as someone committed to education, I want to suggest to you that there is a strong religious argument to be brought to bear here. And that is, as both Richard and particularly Maurice has just underlined, where does the responsibility for the nurturing of faith lie? And I would argue that it lies first of all with parents, and secondly with the faith community to which they belong and in the context of their own religious practice. So that gossamer thread of memory, which so evocatively Jonathan Sacks created, is not the responsibility of the state to preserve, it is the responsibility of family and faith community. And if we are not up to the job ourselves, why should we expect the state to subsidise us and do it for us? So from my point of view, I would say this is an important aspect to bear in mind, that there is a strong religious argument to be made. We talked earlier about education being too important to be left to politicians. You might say religious formation is too important to be handed over to people outside of the family or our own immediate faith community.